In the spring of 1944, Germany was firmly in the grip of war. The Allies had long since gained air supremacy over the Third Reich. German cities were hit by bombing raids almost daily. Apocalypse was normal. The war had arrived on the home front, and its catastrophic course could no longer be concealed.
The bombing of cities like Cologne, Bremen, Hamburg and Berlin was part of everyday life of a significant part of the German population. The war was quite close at hand in and around the Reich, especially since we're talking about massive losses on the part of the German civilian population, as well as the massive losses in the Wehrmacht. That means that from the regime's point of view, the war was not going at all as they imagined.
Nevertheless, maintaining the morale of the people was the job of the home front dictator, Joseph Goebbels. In his function as Gauleiter of Berlin, he personally took charge of the fate of the bombed-out citizens. Perseverance was the motto.
The mood could certainly crumble in one place or another. The regime conceded that, or that there was sadness about losses or worries and hardships after bombing raids. But at the same time, the decisive factor was the people's attitude in the language of Nazi propaganda. And the attitude seemed to be quite stable for a long time from the regime's point of view.
The Germans reacted differently to the tense situation, with fanatical defiance, with equanimity, or even fatalistic resignation. Above all, faith in Adolf Hitler helped many to persevere.
The cult of the Führer was very important because the Führer, despite all the disputes that existed in the system, including the conflicting interests of internal groups and organizations, the Führer was always seen as a figure of identification, as the one who held everything together and brought it all together, and really also as a kind of luminous figure. If one assumed that National Socialism was an atheistic regime, then the Führer took on a quasi-godlike character.
Despite major failures in the second half of the war, which more and more couldn't be denied, the Hitler cult nevertheless remained intact to a large degree because Hitler was the central figure to whom people had already been orienting themselves for years, and there had been no alternative for a long time.
The dictator hadn't been seen in Berlin for quite some time. On the occasion of his 55th birthday, Hitler's most loyal supporter, Joseph Goebbels, organized a propaganda event in the capital in his absence on April 20th to demonstrate the loyalty of the Volksgemeinschaft. A parade was held on Unter den Linden for the Führer, as well as for the National Socialist newsreel.
In der Reichskanzlei tragen sich mit den Vertretern der diplomatischen Missionen Männer, Frauen und Jugendliche aus allen Schichten des Volkes in die Gratulationslisten ein. Reichsminister Dr. Goebbels spricht.
Wenn wir uns ein ganzes Jahr durch unseren Fleiß und durch unsere Tapferkeit zum Werke des Führers bekennen, dann wollen wir uns an seinem Geburtstag einmal auch in Worten, die aus der Tiefe unserer Herzen kommen, zu seiner Person bekennen dürfen. Wünschen wollen wir ihm Gesundheit und Kraft und vor allem eine gesegnete Hand. Wissen soll er zu jeder Stunde, dass er sich auf sein Volk verlassen kann. Auch in diesem Kampfe auf Leben und Tod ist und bleibt er uns das, was er uns immer war, unser Hitler.
You also had to demonstrate a touch of normality in 1944, since everyone knew that April 20th was an important date. Hitler somehow had to show himself. He rarely spoke, he rarely appeared in public, so they had to stage something. Goebbels' speech in the Schlüterhof at the concert of the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra and so on. That was the minimum program put together to show that Hitler was still there and he was still alive.
Hitler ist auch noch da, der lebt auch noch.
Instead of building more and more fighter planes for defensive battles against the Allies, Hitler ordered the production of mainly bombers. Weapons designed to impede the Allied advance also met with the Führer's approval, such as this device for destroying railroad tracks. Hitler didn't comment publicly on the devastation of the air war.
He left it to Goebbels, all this propaganda work, and withdrew more and more from the public eye. Officially, of course, this was with work overload. Hitler was, as it was already described in the propaganda, day and night for Germany's victory and Germany's fate, and therefore he had no time to make speeches. But of course, it was also connected with this loss of prestige that he then withdrew from public life. And thus this myth, of course, continued to have an impact.
For most of the year, Hitler retreated to Berghof in the Berchtesgaden Alps. The dictator, who had always been confident of his effect on the masses, gave only 3 radio speeches in 1944 and made no public appearances.
Goebbels tried for months to persuade Hitler to give a speech in public to give the people hope again. And Hitler didn't want to. He always said, first we need victories again, so as things were, he didn't want to do that.
In view of the lack of success on all fronts, the dictator increasingly doubted his generals' willingness to persevere. Hitler didn't tolerate criticism of his decisions. No one in his entourage dared to point out to the commander-in-chief the hopelessness of the situation. On the contrary.
There was this famous scene at Obersalzberg where Hitler gathered his generals and shouted at them, "And I expect the generals to stand around me with their sabers drawn to defend me till the end." Then Field Marshal von Manstein stood up and said, "Yes, my Führer, that's exactly how it will be."
Meanwhile, in the capital, which had been hit by numerous Allied bombing raids, the air raid alarms blared more and more often, and not just at night. Since March of 1944, U.S. bombers had also been conducting daytime air raids on Berlin. More than 500,000 civilians would fall victim to the bombing. Joseph Goebbels held the fort for his Führer in the capital of the Reich. The Minister of Propaganda used every opportunity as a stage for the newsreel.
Dr. Goebbels überreicht besonders bewährten Kämpfern gegen den verbrecherischen Bombenterror Auszeichnungen.
In his capacity as the Gauleiter of Berlin, Goebbels was close to the people. Nazi propaganda unscrupulously presented the Berliners as steadfast heroes of the air war.
Berlin lässt sich durch die britisch-amerikanischen Luftgangster und Wohnblockknacker nicht erschüttern.
Goebbels just had a built-in instinct to give the people what they wanted. Of course, because he had a large news network that he could pick from, where fluctuations and reversals were also perceived, registered, passed on, and then reacted to.
Und hier eine Sondervorstellung für Bombengeschädigte.
The Germans were to be kept happy until the bitter end. The Minister of Propaganda had vaudeville and cinema performances moved from bombed-out venues to buildings that were still intact. Entertainment during total war. The newsreels did not show the true face of war. Amateur footage of a funeral for bombing victims in Nordenham near Bremerhaven revealed the grief and despair of the people. Despite the horror and fear, Germans had to go on with their daily lives day after day.
Die Herausforderung für Frauen gerade im Krieg
The
war
challenge,
sehr hoch. Die
especially
meisten
for
Männer
women in the
waren
war,
an der
was
Front
very
oder
high.
tot oder
Most of the
vermisst.
men were at the
Ein
front
harter
or
Alltag,
dead
wenn
or
man sich
missing.
vorstellt, dass man,
Life was hard every day.
10 Stunden Fabrikarbeit
Imagine that you
leisten
had
muss,
to
dann
work
nach Hause
10
kommt,
hours in
sich
a
um die Kinder
factory,
kümmert,
then come home,
Hausaufgaben
take
macht.
care of the children,
Dann
do
gibt es
homework,
nachts,
then there were
Luftangriffe, man
air
kann nicht
raids at
schlafen,
night. You couldn't
man
sleep.
hat selber Angst,
You're
die
afraid,
Kinder
the
haben
children are
Angst und
afraid.
nächsten Tag geht
And the
alles
next
wieder,
day it starts all
von
over
vorne
again.
los und das Ganze
And the whole
mit
thing
einer,
is fraught with a
großen
lot of
Unsicherheit behaftet,
uncertainty as to
ob,
whether everyone would even
alle
survive.
das überhaupt überleben würden.
The Allies were already preparing for the next blow against the Third Reich, the invasion on the coast of northern France. The onslaught was to be stopped by the so-called Atlantic Wall, a chain of defensive positions on the Channel coast. The hero of the failed African campaign, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, was responsible for protecting the Reich's borders on the Atlantic. He was responsible for the expansion of the fortifications and making them impregnable.
However, this Atlantic wall wasn't finished yet. It was a wall with big gaps. You can't think of it as a wall. It was more or less like a string of pearls with several points loosely connected.
Here's where the focus of the combatants were, the coastline between Calais and Normandy. The Germans weren't sure exactly where the landings would take place. The expansion of the defensive facilities faltered due to the disastrous war situation, which meant that supplies weren't coming in. Rommel recognized the hopelessness of the venture and put all his eggs in one basket.
It was clear to the Germans where the Allies would land. They would either come in at the Pas de Calais or in Normandy. In the end, the Germans, and especially Rommel, chose the Pas de Calais, and that was the wrong choice.
In England, meanwhile, the Allies' preparations were in full swing. The decision of where to land had already been decided, a different location than what the Germans expected.
Normandy was chosen because Pas de Calais, which would allow a shorter channel crossing, was relatively well fortified by the Germans, and Normandy had the great advantage of being conveniently located. One could approach from all ports.
The
whole of southern England resembled a huge army camp. The Allies prepared for the invasion with elaborate maneuvers. In the meantime, their intelligence services launched deliberate deceptive maneuvers to mislead the Germans. Fictitious units were set up, and dummy tanks and aircraft were used to make the Wehrmacht believe that a channel crossing would take place at Calais. Germany first was Winston Churchill's motto. The only thing the British couldn't agree on with the commander-in-chief of the Americans, Dwight D. Eisenhower, was the timing of the landing on the continent.
And then there's the question of when, and that was a big point of contention between the Americans and the British. The British didn't really want to do it at all. Ultimately, the British wanted to defend their empire and wanted to secure the Mediterranean. The Americans said, what on earth are we doing in the Mediterranean? And then ultimately got their way. But there was a struggle over the crucial question, when would they have enough landing craft?
And while a material battle of gigantic proportions was being prepared on the Atlantic, there was a festive mood in Obersalzburg. Eva Braun's younger sister Gretel married SS Gruppenführer Heinrich Fegelein on June 3, 1944. The Führer was also present at the reception at the Berghof near Berchtesgaden. The celebrations among Hitler's closest friends lasted 3 days. No one here seemed to be thinking about a possible defeat. Hitler was convinced that he could turn back the Allies in France.
Hitler's strategy was as follows. We can lose ground in the east, and that wouldn't threaten our Reich. But in the west, if the Western Allies land there, they could immediately advance into the Ruhr and thus capture the heart of our industry. Therefore, Hitler ordered reinforcements to be sent to the west in the future.
But by the 4th of June, the Germans had lost the capital of their most important ally. The Wehrmacht had been unable to hold Rome and had declared it an open city. The Allies now marched in triumph. and the Romans enthusiastically celebrated their liberation. Enraged, they stormed the Palazzo Venezia, the former seat of government of their Duce Benito Mussolini.
Fascism has never been as strongly entrenched in Italy as National Socialism was in Germany. Mussolini had been deposed by the fascist Grand Council. It was, of course, inconceivable that somehow a National Socialist Grand Council would depose Hitler. And in Italy, at least part of the population saw the state as corrupt and didn't see why they should fight for this fascist state. Of course, there were a few, but not as many as in Germany. And actually, in Italy, war fatigue was much greater than in Germany, and it was clear it was over.
German soldiers were taken prisoner. The Wehrmacht was able to delay the advance of U.S. troops in southern Italy for half a year. However, they had nothing to go against the Allied superiority in men and material. The German military leadership drew no conclusions from the defeat for its future strategy.
And so now you could say that the fall of Rome didn't really matter, but the big question was, how were they actually going to stop the Allied advance? Did they have any means at all to ever become offensive again? They didn't really have that. And they didn't really learn from it. The real problem that actually existed was that the Allies landed in Salerno in September of 43 and in Anzio near Rome in January of 44. And both landing operations were a bit of a prelude, very similar to the procedure to the later landing in Normandy, which was bigger, of course, but in similar principle. And the Germans found they couldn't stop the Allies. It was really a principle of hope, but the prelude as to how D-Day would play out had already been experienced on a smaller scale in Italy, and both battles were lost.
In England, the Allied Commander-in-Chief, General Eisenhower, was planning the final details of the invasion. It was important to determine the right time. The landing had already been postponed several times due to bad weather conditions.
The man with the final say was Eisenhower. He was the commander-in-chief. There was a structure. The British and the Americans had divided the world into theaters of war, and Eisenhower gave the orders. But of course, he also had to coordinate with the British. But he had the final word. And the weather, after all, gets bad in early June. So bad that the Germans didn't think they could land at all. And then, for example, Rommel went to see his wife for her birthday. And that's when Eisenhower gave the green light.
On June 3, 1944, the first Allied troops boarded ships. More than 1.5 million U.S. soldiers were standing by for Operation Overlord. They were joined by nearly 20 divisions of British, Canadians, Poles, and Free French. The German troops couldn't grasp the scale of the attack until it had already begun.
The Normandy landings were indeed one of the very great failures of German intelligence. It was a complete surprise that the largest armada in the history of the world could wham suddenly appear at dawn off the coast of Normandy like a rabbit coming out of a top hat who said, "Oops, here I am." There was no round table of intelligence services in Germany who said, "So, what have we heard from which sources and what is now the most probable?" But rather the Air Force did its own thing. The Navy did its own thing. It was a complete muddle. And that, of course, meant in principle that a surprise could succeed.
It all began in the early morning hours of June 6, 1944, D-Day, Decision Day.
The Allies had assembled an armada, the likes of which the world had never seen. Over 5,000 ships, including 4,000 landing craft, and over 1,000 battleships, cruisers of various kinds. And so on the first day alone, this armada put about 130,000 men ashore.
The soldiers were preparing to land on nearly 100 kilometers of beach. The battle would be won or lost within 24 hours. There was no plan B. If the Allied troops failed, there would be no second chance. There was no turning back.
The Allied landings were meticulously planned. First, Allied naval artillery was to open fire on the German positions. Shortly thereafter, squadrons of Allied bombers would continue to bomb the German positions. And only shortly thereafter would the landing fleet start to come in and quickly overcome the bunkers and move inland.
But from the start, heavy seas hampered the operation. Ships drifted for miles, landing craft capsized, soldiers drowned with their heavy equipment in the freezing waters.
The soldiers knew that they would have to land at low tide and run for more than 800 meters with no cover, and that this was probably not going to be a walk in the park. Some of them had experienced similar landing operations in Italy, but the hope was always that the Allied fire would be so strong that they would get through it all right.
But a lot of bomber squadrons had missed the German positions. There was little cover. The soldiers had to run directly into German fire with their eyes open.
Allied casualties on the various beaches varied widely, ranging from a few hundred, for example, at Salt Beach or Utah Beach, to 3,000 to 4,000 at Omaha Beach, the famous Bloody Omaha. However, despite all these losses, they were not as high as Allied planners had originally planned on. They had expected to suffer up to 10,000 casualties on the first day of landing alone.
Whoever gained the upper hand on this longest day held the key to occupied Europe.
D-Day is legendary in American, British, and Canadian society. It is one of the greatest amphibious landings of World War II. It's the Great Battle that signified the beginning of the liberation of Western Europe. For the British, it was the last great military victory for their army in a conventional war. If you compare it to other battles in world history, the Battle of the Somme or Stalingrad or whatever, June the 6th, 1944, was not a particularly bloody day. And it's so hyped up, particularly in American history, so it has a lot of historical significance. But it wasn't because of the casualties. There were other days in the Battle of Normandy that were bloodier for the soldiers.
On June 6th, the Allies also dropped troops on the continent. During the night, about 20,000 men landed behind the front lines. They too had to struggle with considerable difficulties.
On D-Day, the Allies landed not only from the sea, but they also used paratroopers and cargo gliders in the rear to occupy areas from the rear and prevent the Germans from getting reinforcements to the landing points. American losses were quite high because the Germans had dammed up the rivers there, because they had also built obstacles against cargo gliders in which the material, some of the material was transported. Some parachuted, some landed in gliders. And it was quite a considerable fighting force which also ensured that the Americans could advance inland from the beach relatively quickly. And that also prevented the first German counterattacks.
In the morning, they fought their way to their units. Inland, the Allied troops suffered unexpectedly high losses.
Allied planning prior to the landing was totally focused on the amphibious landing itself. The planners weren't really aware of what happened next, and contrary to expectations, the Germans put up dogged resistance, especially in the hedgerows of Normandy, in the so-called bocage. There were major battles in a very small area where the Allies' advance was bloody, moving from field to field, and sometimes these fields were no larger than 100 by 100 meters. And there were also American reports that refer events there to a jungle war, which reminded some of the war in the Pacific.
Dann haben wir 6 Wochen schwere Kämpfe.
There were 6 weeks of heavy fighting in Normandy, very similar to trench warfare in the First World War. In terms of casualties, the battle was similar to that of Verdun. And for many participants, this battle was one of the most formative of their lives.
Ist für viele Teilnehmer auch.
And you can also glean that from German files how officers, high-ranking officers, who experienced this battle, and how thousands, tens of thousands of Germans died there. And by the way, the Allies had similar losses, but then they realized that they were no match against Allied superiority, and how that changed their view of the war.
Wie das ihre Sicht auf den Krieg verändert.
Commander-in-Chief Rommel tried to convince Hitler that the situation was hopeless. He stubbornly insisted on them holding the front. But the Allies' fighting strength and air superiority were overwhelming. German counteroffensives came to nothing. For these Germans, the war was over. Going into captivity was easier for them than for their comrades on the Eastern Front.
If you look at German casualty figures at the end of the Battle of Normandy, 400,000 soldiers died, were wounded, or became Allied prisoners of war. At the same time, there were about 600,000 German casualties on the Eastern Front. The big difference, however, is that German losses in the West were largely due to captivity. It was clear to German soldiers that as a prisoner of war of the Allies, you were likely to be treated somewhat in accordance with the Geneva Conventions. And so it was much easier for a German soldier on the Western Front to throw up his hands and stop fighting than it was on the Eastern Front.
In the Soviet Union, Stalin also took the initiative. Operation Bagration began on June 22, 1944. On the third anniversary of the German invasion of the Soviet Union, the Red Army struck back. Now that the Allies had finally opened the long-awaited Second Front in the West, Soviet troops launched a devastating strike against the Wehrmacht.
The Soviet offensive against Army Group Center in the summer of 1944 was underrated for a long time. It was overshadowed by the Second Front, the Allied invasion of Normandy. But it was actually the greatest military catastrophe that the German Reich had to endure. Within a few weeks, this Red Army succeeded in crushing the entire Army Group Center.
Die Deutschen sind hoffnungslos unterlegen.
The Germans were hopelessly outnumbered. 2.5 million Soviet soldiers against 1 million Germans. The line of the front was very awkward for the Germans. There was a huge front area sticking out. The rear was partly, or to a large extent, already in the hands of the Soviet partisans. German reconnaissance of the enemy drew completely wrong conclusions and believed that the main attack would take place much further south. And finally, Hitler was also against any sort of mobile warfare.
The dictator had long since tied his personal fate, as well as that of the entire country, to the outcome of the war and forbade any retreat. He didn't have a convincing strategy.
There was always the hope that the Führer was a genius, that the Führer would still do something, that the Führer would pull something out of his back pocket, some miracle weapon, or that he still had some reserves. You just had to hold out long enough. That was actually the propaganda slogan.
Im Morgennebel rücken deutsche Grenadiere zum Angriff auf einen sowjetischen Brückenkopf vor. Über die Straßen Kurlands rollt der Nachschub mit Männern und Panzern, die sich dem sowjetischen Ansturm entgegenwerfen. Ebenso wie die Angloamerikaner erleiden auch die Sowjets täglich hohe Panzerverluste. Auch im Osten hat sich die Panzerfaust großartig bewährt. Grenadiere und Sturmgeschütze in Erwartung eines feindlichen Panzerstoßes. Die ersten T-34 preschen vor und werden abgeschossen.
Stalin also knew how to use propaganda and presented himself as the savior of the Soviet Empire. 2 days before the offensive, he had his submissive comrades award him the Medal for the Defense of Moscow. However, the dictator left the planning of Operation Bagration to his generals.
Stalin, like Hitler, was a military control freak, but he was, one doesn't really know because the files haven't been released yet, he seems to have held back more than his German counterpart.
The Red Army had learned from its failed offensives and attacked with a significantly superior force on a front that was 1,100 kilometers long. The Soviets managed to break through and advance up to 600 kilometers to the west. Army Group Center was crushed. The defeated troops now became part of a perfidious propaganda show. On July 17, 1944, Stalin paraded 55,000 defeated Wehrmacht soldiers through Moscow's streets.
Stalin very cleverly combined this demonstration with a message to the people. The Wehrmacht is not invincible. The Wehrmacht consists to a large extent of old men. The time of the young worldly warriors was over. It was important for him to show his citizens what the people who had invaded their country looked like. And of course, it was a deliberate act of humiliation, which was, of course, forbidden under the laws of war. According to the Geneva Convention, prisoners of war may not be lined up or paraded. They were given castor oil beforehand, so they couldn't contain themselves, and after the soldiers had marched through, Moscow's street cleaning vehicles cleaned up after them. That was a cynical and nasty spectacle. They wanted to show the master race were just poor wretches, and that worked quite well. You saw fat generals who corresponded exactly to this image of the fat, overfat general, and you saw emaciated soldiers who were often much older, the last troops that Hitler had left marching through the streets. It didn't trigger the effect on the people that it was supposed to. The police didn't have to keep the citizens of Moscow from attacking the Wehrmacht soldiers. Instead, they simply stood silently at the side of the road. They actually felt sorry for these soldiers because they saw in them their own soldiers. Nevertheless, it was important to Stalin and his people to demonstrate precisely that. They had come as the master race, and now they showed the people this is what they look like.
3 days earlier, Adolf Hitler had traveled to his headquarters in Rastenburg, East Prussia. Many of the buildings in the complex had been covered with bunkers to protect them from air attacks, but the Nazi leadership was not prepared for an attack from within. On July 20th, 1944, a bomb exploded during a meeting with the Führer. It had been smuggled into the barracks by Claus von Stauffenberg. He had gathered a circle of conspirators around him. They were convinced that Hitler had to die in order to save Germany from ruin.
On the one hand, he recognized the criminal character of this war, and that this war was lost, and that more and more people would die. There could no longer be a victory, and therefore it had to be stopped. The problem for Stauffenberg was how to get to Hitler. He was just a small fry in the high command of the army in the Wendler block. He couldn't just walk into the Führer's headquarters and say, I would like an appointment with the Führer, and give him an explosive. The problem was that very few conspirators had access, but he finally got access when he became the Chief of Staff of the Army Reserve on July the 1st, 1944. That gave him the right to attend briefings, and that then put him in a dual role, being the head of the coup and also the one to plant the bomb.
The destroyed barracks meeting room bears witness to the force of the explosion. But Adolf Hitler survived the assassination attempt, and later that same afternoon, just 3 hours after the attack, welcomed Benito Mussolini at Wolfslair train station. Together, they visited the destroyed barracks. That night, in a mobile radio van he had brought in specially for the purpose, Hitler delivered a radio address. he presented himself in his tried and tested manner as the leader chosen by fate.
Ich selbst bin völlig unverletzt. Ich fasse das als eine Bestätigung des Auftrags der Vorsehung auf, mein Lebensziel weiter zu verfolgen, so wie ich es bisher getan habe. Es ist ein ganz kleiner Klüngel verbrecherischer Elemente, die jetzt unbarmherzig ausgerottet werden.
Und dann beginnt die Maschinerie.
Then the machinery of the Third Reich began to unearth this conspiracy. And there are hundreds of people, 800, 900, who are also executed. And anyone who had a connection with the 20th of July then died.
Wenn einer mit dem 20. Juli in Verbindung kommt, dann ist er des Todes.
Most are subjected to a show trial before the People's Court. This film footage, shot on Hitler's orders, was never shown. Even Nazi propaganda found the grating roar of presiding judge Roland Freisler unsuitable for publicity.
An die vielen Morde.
Morde? Sie sind ja ein Schäbjolum!
Many of the conspirators retained their dignity, although the verdicts were a foregone conclusion. Death by hanging. They were executed in Plötzensee prison with wire nooses hung on meat hooks and filmed for Hitler. The terror of Nazi rule reached one of its cruel climaxes.
Entscheidend war das Attentat eigentlich dafür, dass danach
The assassination was actually a decisive moment because afterwards the Nazi system had a much tighter grip on
seit dem
society.
Juli 44, da fallen alle Schranken fürs
After
System.
July of 1944, all checks to the system had gone.
Puffer mehr dazwischen.
And now
Wer jetzt
there was no buffer
den
at
Kopf
all
ausstreckt,
between them.
Wird seinen Kopf kürzer gemacht und jetzt kann das System
Anyone who
wirklich
stuck their head up
durchgreifen.
now lost it. And now the system could really take action and had such a tight grip on German society that they were able to divide the
dass sie in
society
der Lage
and
sind,
drag it down with them.
diese Gesellschaft zu teilen, mit sich in den Untergang zu reißen.
In the course of their offensive, Soviet troops reached Lublin on July 24th. Here, they stumbled upon the remains of a monstrous crime.
As the Red Army advanced toward Lublin, Soviet soldiers also liberated the Majdanek death camp. And Majdanek was actually the first real death camp that the Allies liberated.
In view of the rapid advance of the Red Army, SS troops had hastily tried to cover up their misdeeds just a day before and ordered the camp to be closed. However, they weren't able to destroy the gas chambers. As early as August, the first journalists visited Majdanek and published photos and reports. Tens of thousands were murdered in this camp. Here, for the first time, the full extent of the genocide made possible by this criminal war was revealed.
Majdanek was by no means the largest and most important extermination camp. But for the first time, the Allies had an idea of what had transpired, and they had issued a communiqué. It was then translated into 5 languages. And the effect cannot be imagined strongly enough. Because, of course, all war propaganda tends to be exaggerated. But the Allies were suddenly confronted with a reality that actually completely confirmed these exaggerations. And that, of course, was a completely different dimension. And then there was also the practical attempt to preserve it as a place of remembrance, even during the war. And in the months that followed, things continued. And I think it was Thomas Mann who wrote, "This secret is about to be revealed, and the disgrace of Germany will lie before the eyes of the world."
While the war was still in full swing, a memorial service for the victims of the death camp was held on August 6th and was reported worldwide.
Die Befreiung der Konzentrationslager hat ja,
I think the liberation of the concentration camps had a very decisive impact on how the Germans were viewed. For the Americans, the war was a conventional war against another military power, fought more or less according to the rules of the Geneva Conventions. Eisenhower couldn't have imagined what was happening in those camps. And the first camp Eisenhower saw shocked him in such a way that after that, the Wehrmacht was no longer a subject worthy of discussion for him. He also refused to receive any German general. After they had seen that, they had a completely different view of the Wehrmacht, because they saw they defended it. They had camps like that in the hinterlands, and they knew it, and they defended this regime.
Und sie haben das gewusst und haben dieses Regime verteidigt.
The victors forced the German soldiers to see the horror with their own eyes. Even if not all of them were direct perpetrators, blind obedience often led to inconceivable crimes. And yet, no one made another attempt, like the conspirators on July 20th, to overthrow the criminal regime in order to end the Nazi terror. On the Western Front, Allied troops struggled for weeks to break out of the Normandy beachhead. They wanted to advance toward the Seine as soon as possible. The Germans put up stubborn resistance. For weeks, they engaged in heavy fighting with the Allies. By the end of July, the Wehrmacht had suffered almost 115,000 dead and wounded, plus more than 40,000 were made prisoners. Supplies also failed to arrive. Finally, the German front line collapsed.
It took 8 weeks for the Allies to finally break through. That's because the Allies, using their artillery and air power, inflicted heavy losses on the Germans, until the Germans simply didn't have the ability to reinforce their front lines. And so the breakthrough occurred on July 25th.
U.S. troops reached the suburbs of Paris, where the liberators were greeted enthusiastically. The fight for France's freedom seemed to be over. The Allies had landed in Provence as well. But Hitler, enraged, ordered his generals to raze the French capital to the ground before they retreated.
Hitler's idea was that Paris had to burn and that his general there, General Choltitz, should destroy Paris. General von Choltitz was told by the American general, I think it may have been Eisenhower, that if you destroy the city of Paris, you will be held responsible after the war.
The warning was that he would be treated as a war criminal if he dared to carry out the destruction order. In fact, on the day of the liberation of Paris, there were still sporadic exchanges of fire between U.S. troops and German soldiers. It's possible that those were only mock battles with which Choltitz wanted to cover up his refusal to obey Hitler's orders.
Choltitz was maneuvering, he was in charge, and he maneuvered back and forth until he actually no longer had the means. He used his leeway in such a way that at some point he no longer had the means, or lacked the necessary explosives to reduce Paris to rubble.
On the afternoon of July 25th, Choltitz officially handed the city over to French forces under the command of Major General Leclerc. Enfin, on respire, was the cry those days. At last, we can breathe a sigh of relief. All of Paris was in the streets. The Germans had been defeated.
The summer of 1944 meant 3 heavy defeats for the Germans. First, in the west, occupied France was lost. In the east, Army Group Center was crushed. And in the south, Rome was lost and the Germans had to retreat to northern Italy. Nevertheless, that didn't mean that the war was over. There were several reasons for that. One of them was that the Germans were not thrown back on their borders. And that created a special motivation for many soldiers. Now they were fighting for their homeland, for their own farm, for their own house.
For these soldiers, the war was over. Many were relieved to have finally escaped the hopeless struggle. But many were also driven by fear. Soon, the Allies would be at the borders of the Third Reich. They would not be able to save their country from the ravages of impending doom.